So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your day for the Salesforce Admins webinar, Best Practices for Rolling Out New Functionality. Welcome to March 1st. It's spring already. So to get us started, I'm very excited to be joined by Jackie Doan, who is the practice lead of declarative development at Zeed Consulting Group. You can follow her, and I highly suggest that you do, at Jackie Doan on Twitter. My name is Mike Gerholt. I am admin evangelist at Salesforce, and you can follow me on Twitter at Mike Gerholt. And of course, it wouldn't be a Salesforce Admins webinar or just really any Salesforce presentation if we didn't have our forward-looking statements. So please make all of your purchasing decisions based on current features and functionality and not on any future functionality that we may mention. Being the webinar, we want you to be social with us, so just a reminder that if you are on Twitter like Jackie and I are, you can also follow Salesforce Admins, and that's Salesforce Admins, no I, to learn about all of the latest and greatest stuff that we have coming out. And you can connect with other awesome admins using the hashtag AwesomeAdmin. If you're on Facebook, you can find our Facebook page at Salesforce Admins. And we're also on YouTube, where we have tons of really cool recorded stuff. We are Salesforce Admins on YouTube, which reminds me that this webinar will be recorded, and you can find it on our YouTube page or on the webinar recap page, which was the same URL that you used to register. So you can go back and take even more notes. Now, I know you'll probably have questions while you take those notes, so join us in our Salesforce Admins webinar group on Success Community. This is the go-to place for all of the Q&A around this webinar. You can get there by going to bit.ly/admin webinar group. Please pay attention to the capitalization. Or if you're in the Success Community and you're logged in already, just type in Salesforce Admins webinar into the search and you can find us. Go ahead and ask your question as soon as you think of it, but also pay attention, see what other people are asking. That way we don't have any duplicate questions. Be sure to stick around for the end of the webinar where we'll do live Q&A as time permits. So with that, I want to turn it over to our awesome admin, Jackie, to talk us through today's agenda and get us started. Jackie?
Thank you so much, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, my name is Jackie. I'm a practice lead at Exceed Consulting Group, and we're a Salesforce partner based out of Detroit. A little bit about me. I've been using Salesforce for over a decade as an end user, as an admin, and as a consultant. I've got 6 certifications, including Sales Cloud Consultant, Service Cloud Consultant, so I know what I'm talking about. I'm also very active in the Success community, so if you want to get in touch, get me on the Success community or follow me on Twitter at Jackie Doan. Before we get into the agenda, I want to start with an overview of what is a deployment. So for some of you who might be new admins, you want to make changes in your org, but you realize, hey, there's some issues here. Maybe there's some challenges. Maybe it's kind of intimidating. So let's talk about what a deployment is. It's really just the simple process of moving changes from one environment to another. Now that might be from sandbox to sandbox. That might be from sandbox to production. But, it's just basically moving changes. And when we say changes, that could be standing up a brand new instance of Salesforce, or it could be just moving a couple fields from one place to another. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing we'll talk about is why a deployment might fail. Next, we'll cover the main considerations when devising a successful deployment strategy, and we'll talk about the 3 key phases of deployment plans with some pro tips sprinkled along the way. Finally, we'll do a review of the key takeaways, and we'll provide some ways to find out more information. There's a famous quote that says, "Learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself." As I mentioned earlier, I've been around the Salesforce ecosystem for quite a while. I've done more deployments than I care to count. I've done small deployments, a single validation rule. I've done big deployments, global call center rolled out across thousands of users. And since I've done so many deployments, that means I have made a lot of mistakes. And I'm here today to help you learn what took me many deployments to figure out. Deployment fish. If you've ever deployed a change set in Salesforce, you've probably seen some of these little pesky deployment fish. It's not a fun sight to see when you're in the middle of go live or when you're trying to fix a critical production issue and you've got business users breathing down your neck. Deployment can be really challenging. And because it can be so challenging, some people avoid it altogether and just go and configure things right in production. Unfortunately, that can be even more dangerous. One of our customers, they're a mid-sized tech firm, and they have a website that allows customers to purchase services. Recently, their admin created a validation rule in production that was meant to enforce certain behaviors in their internal users, but they didn't specify the rule was only for internal users. And since they created it right in production, they didn't have a chance to test it out. So when a consumer logged onto the website, they didn't have access to that field that the validation rule was on, and it took down their entire system. Customers could not log in and place orders. So even the smallest changes need to follow a proper deployment strategy. So this brings us to an admin's number one rule: thou shalt not develop in production. All changes should be made in the sandbox and then deployed without exception. So we all know if we don't learn from the past, we are doomed to repeat it. So let's take a look at some of the common reasons a deployment might fail. In my experience, deployment failures can be placed into three categories: hard failures, soft failures, and adoption failures. Now, a hard failure is a little bit self-explanatory. It means you're stuck. You can't move forward. Your change set didn't deploy for some reason. Maybe it was missing dependencies, deploying items out of order, or insufficient access, or there was something in production that was configured previously and you couldn't make your change. Soft failures sound a bit nicer, but they're actually kind of tedious. It looks innocent, but it causes much more trouble for you and your end users. This one tricks you into thinking, hey, everything worked well, my change set deployed, but something's not working right. Maybe you didn't set security properly, or maybe some data was missing, or maybe our new code broke something that used to work. Those are the areas that you don't find out about until after you deploy, and those are no fun. Finally, there's adoption failures, and those are less related to deployment issues and more related to change management. Did you communicate the changes to your end users and provide them appropriate training? What's the value in amazing functionality if nobody uses it? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. I know it's trite, but it really does have value. A deployment plan is the single most important tool in an admin's toolbox to ensure a successful deployment. Now, that's really important, so I'm going to repeat that. A deployment plan is the single most important tool in an admin's toolbox to help ensure a successful deployment. So if we need to develop a deployment plan, let's talk about how we're going to do that. What's our strategy? So a deployment plan will provide three key items. First, it will provide traceability to ensure that the changes that you're making can be tracked and measured, which will reduce the possibility of missing components and deployment failures. Accountability will ensure that key players understand and accept their responsibilities. And communication will ensure everyone, all team members, key stakeholders, end users, executive level, knows what to expect, when am I getting my awesome new functionality, and when they can expect it. So there's key questions I like to ask before I actually start creating my plan. Who? Who will be executing the deployment? Is it a developer, an admin, or someone else unrelated to the project? What information will they need to conduct the deployment? And do we have a user identified to perform business validation? That's a big one that people often forget. What tools are we going to be using? Are we going to be using change sets? Are we going to be using Eclipse, Data Loader, Workbench? There's lots of different options out there. If we need to train end users, are we including a training program, training documentation? How are we doing that? When will we be doing the deployment? Is this a good time? Is there anyone going on vacation? What's the business impact of the timing of this deployment? So, you don't want to deploy a brand new system for an accounting team at year end or quarter end, because that's not a great time for them to learn new functionality. So all of these questions that you need to ask yourself feed into your plan. And I like to divide my plan into three different parts, or three phases. So there's pre-deployment, during deployment, and post-deployment. So you need to plan for the pre-deployment work that you're going to be doing, the actual steps you need to take during the deployment, and critically, and most often forgotten, post-deployment. a lot of times people think, hey, I pushed my changes, everything's good to go. But that's where a lot of people make the most critical mistakes. So the first part we're going to talk about is the pre-deployment step. This is what I like to call document everything. There's a lot of documentation involved in a successful plan, but that's what makes the plan successful. And when it comes to deployment, you can't be too thorough when it comes to documentation. So let's take a look at all the different things we'll be documenting. Now I'm going to say this, it's really important. Based on what you're deploying, you might need everything I'm talking about here and more, or you might need just a tiny fraction of it. So take what I'm giving you here as kind of a guide, and then adjust that guide to fit your needs. So if you're part of a large project, one of the first things that I like to make sure we have in place is a deployment timeline. And this can feed into your project timeline. It can be a part of the project timeline. And a lot of times the project manager will already have taken care of some of this for you, but it's really a critical piece. So what's going to happen and when is it going to be happening? So all of the dates. Who do we need for each phase of the deployment? Is there any governance or change management steps required by your organization? Some organizations, larger enterprise organizations, have toll gates that they need to pass through. What does our training schedule look like? When are we going live? And when are we having our celebration party? That's important. So the next phase is the deployment elements. Now I want to mention here the screenshot here on the left-hand side of the screen. It's a little bit easier to see for those users who have larger monitors, but don't get too caught up in this. This is just a sample, and we will have these actual documents posted after the webinar on the webinar page. So the elements doc makes it easier for anyone who's building a change set to ensure that all of the pieces are in place. It includes information such as the object, the data type, the name, the change set number, and any manual steps that are needed for configuration. So imagine when you're building a change set, you have a list of all of the items that you need to include in your change set that's been validated prior to actually having to build your change set. It will make building your change set much easier. So how many people here have deployed a fantastic dashboard, but maybe you forgot the dashboard folder, or maybe you forgot the report type if it was a custom report type? Those errors are incredibly frustrating because it should be obvious, but sometimes it's just not. Documenting all of the changes as you make them will help ensure you don't experience those time-consuming deployment errors. So do you have cases in your change set? Make sure you include the support processes. Are you doing entitlements? Make sure you include the milestones, those types of things. This brings me to our first pro tip. So the setup audit trail is a fantastic resource to help you identify what you've changed. I know it can be really intimidating to remember, how am I possibly going to remember everything that I changed along the way? Well, setup audit trail is there to help. There's also an app called Config Workbook, which you can find on the App Exchange, that will help you figure out all the elements that you need that need to be deployed. And Config Workbook actually allows you to download a copy of all of your org workflow and fields and everything, all of your metadata, into an Excel document, and then you can take that prior to your change starting, and then after you've completed your project work, and compare the two and say, oh, this is what I changed, now I know what needs to be deployed. So next we're going to talk about the actual execution. What steps do we need to follow, and what order do we need to follow them in? So again, this is a screenshot on the right here. That document will be posted on the deployment webinar page. But the main question to ask yourself here is, again, what steps do we need to follow and what order do we need to follow them in? And a lot of times when it comes to a deployment, the order is very important. So obviously you need to create your change sets. That's a given, right? If you're deploying via change sets, that's really important. Do I need to include profiles in those change sets? Sometimes that's a yes and sometimes that's a no. If you're creating a brand new profile into an existing org, it might be a better idea to clone an existing profile in production first and then push your changes, including profiles. What sandbox do I need to create the change set in? Are we working out of UAT? Are we working out of staging? Do we just have one dev sandbox? What environment am I moving the steps to? Again, are we going from UAT to staging, or are we just going from dev right to production? One time I was deploying, and then if my changes have to be deployed in multiple steps, what order do they need to go in? Again, order of operations is really critical here, and I want to give you an example of that. Once I was deploying a large Service Cloud solution, and my change included entitlements and a process and a flow. And the process and flow automated adding the entitlement to the case as soon as the case was created, which is a fantastic option. However, the entitlement processes deploy as inactive by default, and my process needed an active entitlement process in order to function properly. So I had to break those up into two different change sets. I had to deploy my entitlement process first, activate it, and then I could deploy my process. But I could not deploy them together in order to get the validation to complete appropriately. So it's really important that you need more than just to know that you need more than just the specific elements to include in your change set. You need to make sure you have the sound strategy for moving them. And so this brings me to my next pro tip. If you use Chrome as your browser, Booster for Salesforce, and that Booster with no E in it, is life-changing. It's really, really fantastic. And so my favorite features for deployment include ability to search when adding items to a change set, being able to filter by type when adding to a change set, and being able to show all items of a given type on one page when adding items to a change set. So you can say, show me all of the case fields, and you don't actually have to sort by the object and then scroll, next page. It's kind of maddening. So Booster allows you to do some of that. It also does lots of other great things. I could extol about this wonderful app for a long time, but go ahead and get it. And it's a Chrome extension, so you can find it on the Chrome extension store. My next pro tip, Apex tests. Run them early and often. Run all of the Apex tests in your production org well in advance of your deployment to make sure you don't have anything to fix before you start your deployment, and continue to run them throughout the life of the project. So if that's the first thing you do when you start your project is let's run our Apex test. That's going to make sure that things don't break. And that's true for sandboxes as well when you do deployments. Excuse me. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the during deployment steps. But before we talk about that one, let's go to my next pro tip. Quick deploy. I don't know if you've used quick deploy, but it's really great. If you've got a single change set or you've got multiple independent change sets, this is a fantastic feature. It allows you to run all of the tests once for your change set during your validation, and then you don't have to run them again. So if you haven't used this before, try it. But just a word of caution, if you make any configuration changes after you validate your change set, quick deploy goes away, and you have to run your tests again. So if you're in an org where it takes 8, 10, 12 hours to run your tests, which I've been part of lots of those, being able to run the quick deploy, the validate, before I go to bed, wake up in the morning, and then I can do quick deploy, makes things much easier. So during deployment, I call this one pulling the trigger. Again, what steps do we need to follow? In what order? Do I need to deactivate anything before I can deploy? I'm sure if you guys have used processes, Process Builder, you know that even though technically they're bulkified, often they can cause your Apex test to fail. So maybe we need to deactivate a process or an existing version of a flow. Actually deploy your change set, get your configuration moved. But once we do that, what other manual steps do we need to take? We have to activate our flow versions, our workflow rules, configure security appropriately, and then you have to load data too often. And it might not just be loading new data, it might be updating existing data. So if you're creating a new record type on accounts, or you're creating record types for accounts in the first place, you have to update all of your existing accounts to the correct record type. So this brings me to our next pro tip, the nuances of change sets. So these are just some fun things to remember when you're deploying that have tripped us up in the past. So if you deploy a queue, the unformatted list view comes with it, and the visibility is set to all internal users. So if you only have 5 members that are part of a specific queue, every user is going to be able to see that change set, or to see that list view. And the list view fields that come with it are just the default fields, not formatted to your specific fields. If you've included profiles in your change set, the security on those profiles is only set for the items included in your change set. So if you've deployed cases and accounts, but you didn't deploy opportunities because opportunities weren't changing, If you create a new profile, those new profiles won't have any access to the opportunities object because you're not deploying anything for them. Custom settings deploy, but custom setting records don't. So consider using custom metadata types instead of custom settings. It's something new that was released, I think, 2 or 3 releases ago, and it's actually a great option because it's a newer version of custom settings and that allows you to deploy records. Some items just aren't deployable with change sets, like changes to standard pick list fields. So if you've changed your case type field or you've changed your case priority field, you can't deploy that. You have to reconfigure that manually in production. And business processes. So those are service or support processes and sales processes. So your status fields for cases and opportunities, those will only show up under the dependencies section of your change set. You actually can't find that as selectable, but that will prevent your change set from deploying if the values in your support process in production don't match the support process values in your sandbox. So finally, we've talked about pre-deployment, we've talked about during deployment, so let's talk about the final phase, post-deployment. So again, what steps do we need to follow and what order? Update existing data to reflect new values. Again, record types, right? It's a really great example. Or maybe we've added new status values for cases or accounts. Deactivating old approval processes, old entitlement processes, making sure that we don't have things running at the same time. Entitlement processes in particular are a big one. If you created a new version of an entitlement process, make sure you run an update to ensure all of your cases are on the newest version of that entitlement process. And then make sure you complete user validation. Just because it works as a system administrator, that doesn't mean it's going to work as an end user. And that's really something we find a lot that happens, because if you forget one little setting, you forget to configure your sharing rules, or you forget to update a value in a pick list, that could cause validation to fire. It could cause users being completely stopped and unable to continue in the work that they're doing. So my next pro tip, go with the flow and the process too. So flow versions and processes are deployed as inactive by default, and you have to manually activate them. If you're deploying an entitlement process, make sure you run an update. And if you're able to enable that administrators can log in as any user feature to make your life much easier when it comes to validating your changes post-deployment. If you don't have to rely on a business user to log in and validate their changes, it makes it much easier so that you can just log in as a user and make those validate those changes yourself. So, in conclusion, planning makes perfect. The single most important thing that an admin can do to ensure a successful deployment is to create a solid plan. But if things go wrong, and they often do, learn from your mistakes. Even the best laid plans can fail, but learn from the errors to make sure things go more smoothly the next time. Document everything. It's impossible to over-document when it comes to deployment. Validation is required. You have to test as an end user to make sure that everything is deployed properly. And there's tools that can help you. Things like Quick Deploy, Setup Audit Trail, Config Workbook, Booster for Salesforce, those things can make your life much easier. So let's talk about some resources. So there's a few Trailhead badges that I recommend following up on. Change management and application lifecycle management, both talk about deployment processes, and some documentation there as well that can help you. Also, custom metadata types is a trail, or the module rather, that will give you some more information about custom settings versus custom metadata types. And that one actually has an exercise that will allow you to practice setting up custom metadata types in a dev org. Go to the registration page for the Salesforce admins. Again, we're going to have the sample documents posted there. Hit me up on Twitter, hit me on @JackieDoan, or you can email me. There's my email address, jdoan@exceed.com. And you can find me on the Success community as well.
Thanks, Jackie. And just to kind of wrap up before we get to some Q&A, so if you have any questions, you can post them in the admin webinar group. And bit.ly, the easiest way to get there is bit.ly/admin webinar group. We'll be sending out a survey. You can access that at bit.ly/AW admin webinar survey -functionality. And of course, we will have Jackie's slides available at bit.ly/new functionality. And of course, I'm sure they'll be on the webinar group too. So with that, let's jump over while we have a little bit of time for some questions. Jackie, I know you talked a lot about managing a deployment, and there's pre-deployment steps and during deployment and post-deployment steps. And I was kind of sitting back and thinking about my single admin days. Feels like a lot to take on. Do you have any tips for admins who are flying solo on how to tackle a deployment?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for me personally, when I was doing the solo admin stuff, I had to be my own boss, kind of, right? So I had to make sure that I wrote everything down, and that was my critical piece. Was that when I failed to document things, that's when I missed something. So I would write down everything that I had changed. I would do it in usually an Excel document, and this was back in the days before we had things like the Config Workbook app or any of those. So I would comb through the setup audit trail. But now we've got apps that can help us with that. So that deployment element phase is critical. And then if I had multiple sandboxes, I would test my deployment in a second sandbox so that I wasn't just saying, hey, things are ready to go, and then I forgot something, right? So I personally like to use a second sandbox to push things, to see what's going to break, to see, just to kind of do a test, right? To see how is this going to work? Am I going to get failures? Is there something I'm not considering? Oftentimes, depending on whether or not you've got a lot of developer resources available, there might be some new release that caused your Apex test to fail or something like that you're not aware of until you're actually getting ready to do deployment. So being able to have that practice run, as I call it, was very valuable to me. So I'd like to do that. And then being able to do that login as any user is really critical as well. And if I have a business user that I trust that kind of knows their stuff, I'll ask them to do some post-deployment validation as well if I don't have a big team of people helping me out.
Very cool. Speaking of big teams of people, so the day of deployment, because I know you kind of manage everything before, and then hopefully we've done a lot of training and got everybody up to speed, and then it comes the day of. How do you manage, or what do you suggest admins do to manage questions that come in so that they're not running around and answering the same questions or doing a reply to 10 different people with the same answer? How do you manage questions?
Absolutely. Chatter is an awesome resource for that. So creating a chatter group for this specific piece of functionality or adding a topic for that specific piece of functionality. So if I'm deploying a new piece of functionality, maybe a new page layout or some new record types or a new process or flow to users who are already existing users, and I'm not onboarding new users, I will tell them, mention me on Chatter in this specific group, and I'll keep answering questions throughout the day. And that's really the most effective way I find, because otherwise you will have everyone, instant messaging you or sending you emails. And if someone sends me an email, doesn't follow the process, but I think it's something that would be valuable, I'll add that as a post in that Chatter group as well to make sure that everyone's got visibility to it.
Smart. I like it. Well, we just hit our time limit, so if you have any more questions for Jackie, go ahead and go to our webinar group and post them there. We'll be sure to follow up. Of course, you can also tweet at Jackie and ask her those amazing questions as well. So, Jackie, thank you for presenting this amazing content, and thank you for taking time out of your day.